are likely to happen today at around 3 p.m. Eastern. They also expect to debate and vote on 2 judicial nominations during today's session. This is live coverage of the U.S. Senate on C-SPAN 2.
The Senate will come to order. The chaplain, Dr. Barry Black, will lead the Senate in prayer.
Let us pray. Almighty God, unto whom all hearts are open, all desires known, and from whom no secrets are concealed, cleanse the thoughts of our hearts by the inspiration of your Holy Spirit, that we may perfectly love you and worthily magnify your holy name. Lord, look with mercy upon our senators and use them to heal the brokenness in our land. May they use their talents to lead people to replace fear with faith, cynicism with courage, and division with unity. Keep them from the forces that impede them from doing your will. We pray in your merciful name. Amen.
Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance to our flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., November 3, 2011. To the Senate. Under the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Tom Udall, a senator from the state of New Mexico, to perform the duties of the chair, signed Daniel K. Inouye, President pro tempore.
Mr. President.
Majority Leader is recognized.
Following leader remarks, the Senate will debate the motions to proceed S. 1769 and S. 1786. One is a Democratically sponsored infrastructure bill. The other is Republican-sponsored. The time until 3 will be equally divided and controlled between the 2 leaders or the designees. At about 3, there'll be up to 2 roll call votes. The first will be on the motion to proceed S. 1769, the Rebuild America Jobs Act. If that is unsuccessful, there'll be a second vote on the motion to proceed S. 1786. Both motions will require 60 votes. We also expect votes on a number of judicial nominations today. Mr. President, yesterday evening, I called my friend from Searchlight, Nevada, named Arthur Frajejo. Arthur's family have been in Searchlight for many, many years. His mom and dad have passed away. I keep in touch with him. He's a wonderful, hardworking man. I said, "Where are you today, Arthur?" He said, "I'm at work." I said, "You're kidding. Where are you?" He said, he said, "This project out by Prim." He said, "It's a big solar project." I said, "How long have you been working?" And I don't remember what he said, a matter of weeks. First job he's had in 3 years. He's an iron worker. He's working now, and he's very, very happy. Here's an iron worker. It's a construction worker, has finally found a job. Well, Mr. President, we have in Nevada thousands of other people who have been out of work for a long period of time, construction workers, just like Arthur. Most of them aren't fortunate enough to have a job that he has. And that's what our legislation is all about. The legislation we'll vote on this afternoon deals with putting people back to work, hundreds of thousands of construction workers. And, Mr. President, this is a bill that's not more deficit spending. It's a bill that's paid for. And it's not an attack on millionaires and billionaires. Many millionaires and billionaires are very fortunate that they may not in a given year make $1 million, but they still have assets and they're millionaires and billionaires. So what we've done is made sure that a small percentage of Americans would help us put people like Arthur back to work. And it's what we have suggested in our legislation is so reasonable and so fair. What we're saying is that people who make all this money, more than $1 million a year, should contribute to this restructuring of our economy. The plan is by asking these people to contribute just a little more to get the economy back on track. Mr. President, we're not asking all millionaires and billionaires. We're asking people who make more than $1 million a year to pay a little bit extra. It's the right thing to do. It amounts to 0.2% of the people who make money in America. 0.2%. It's unbelievable that the Republicans have lined up in the past, and we've heard they're going to do the same thing today, in unanimous opposition to this common sense plan supported by people all over America. Not Democrats only, not independents only, but Democrats, independents, and Republicans. Americans are crying for jobs. They're crying for us to pass this bill. This would put 3,000 or 4,000 people to work in Nevada. I think that's extremely important, and every state is the same. I talked to my friend yesterday from New Mexico, state of New Mexico. Senator Bingham, the senior senator from New Mexico, said it would put 4,000 people to work in New Mexico. New Mexico's economy is not as troubled as Nevada's, but they're not doing as well as they have in years past. This legislation levies a small tax on the top 0.2% of American taxpayers. These are the same Americans whose income has increased 275% over the last 3 decades. Mr. President, the top 1% of these people in America make as much as the other 99% put together. And we're being told that, well, we would like to help you, but we've taken a tax pledge from this person named Grover Norquist. As Alan Simpson said, does that mean more than your country? And if it does, Alan Simpson says, you shouldn't be in Congress.
Mr. President.
The Republican leader is recognized.
We're going to see 2 very different approaches to infrastructure and job creation today. The American people can decide for themselves which one makes more sense. The Republican proposal extends the current highway bill for another 2 years, giving states and contractors the certainty they need to start new infrastructure projects and to create jobs. The legislation Senator Hatch is proposing today puts an end to the uncertainty for the next 2 years. This proposal also gives states the authority to decide how this money is spent. If folks in Ohio or Kentucky want to build a bridge, Washington can't force them to build a bike path. The Republican proposal accelerates the review period and clears away the bureaucratic red tape. The President admitted a few months ago that the shovel-ready projects in his first stimulus bill didn't turn out to be as shovel-ready as he thought. Our proposal helps make sure they are. Our bill prohibits the EPA from imposing burdensome and unnecessary new regulations on American cement producers and domestic boilers. So the cost of American-made materials for the projects paid for through this highway bill don't skyrocket just as they're set to begin. The bill keeps those costs down. Best of all, it's fully paid for through funds that were originally appropriated for another purpose, but not spent. Whatever's left over after these projects are funded goes to pay down the deficit. Now, the Democrats are taking a different approach. First, according to CBO, the Democratic proposal will do little for the economy and putting people back to work in the short term because the money will be spent very gradually. According to CBO, less than 1/10 of the funds in the Democratic proposal will be spent next year. Less than 1/10 of the funds in the Democratic proposal we'll be voting on later today will be spent next year. And roughly 40% won't be spent until after 2015. After 2015. This hardly matches the President's call for doing something, quote, right away. Second, it costs another $57 billion we don't have. Third, they want to pay for this temporary spending bill with a permanent tax increase on job creators. They want to pay for a temporary spending bill with a permanent tax hike on job creators. And fourth, they already know that Republicans, and yes, some Democrats, don't think we should be taxing job creators, particularly at a time when 14 million Americans are looking for a job, and that we'll vote against any proposal that does so. In other words, the Democrats have deliberately designed this bill to fail. Deliberately designed the bill to fail. So the truth is, Democrats are more interested in building a campaign message than in rebuilding roads and bridges. And frankly, the American people deserve a lot better than that. The people of Kentucky deserve a lot better than that. The people in my state have serious, time-sensitive bridge projects. The Brent Spence Bridge, the I-69 Bridge, the Louisville Bridges, the Sherman-Minton Bridge, which is currently shut down. They deserve better than this. The Associated General Contractors of America and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce have already spoken out against the Democratic proposal. The rest of the American people can decide which approach they prefer. Our proposal, which doesn't add to the deficit, doesn't raise taxes, empowers the states to make decisions on the local level, and is designed to gain bipartisan support, or the Democrats' top-down approach, which perpetuates uncertainty, raises taxes on business at a time when we should be giving them more reasons to hire, not less, and which was designed in coordination with the White House political team to fail. These are the two approaches on display in the Senate today. The choice, Mr. President, should be obvious.
Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
The highway bill has been worked on for months by Senator Boxer, the chairman, and the ranking member, Senator Inhofe. And they've arrived at a conclusion. I had a conversation yesterday with Senator Inhofe, and they've worked out almost all the details on that bill. That bill, we have to do something on that because it expires at the end of this year, 1st of February, I believe. Mr. President, my friend, the Republican leader, who I care a great deal about personally, is absolutely wrong. The American people support our approach. 76% of the American people like it, of all political definitions, support it. Why? Because it's so fair. We're asking the top 0.2% of people who make money in this country to contribute a surtax of 0.7% of money they make over $1 million. Job creators? I don't think so. The funding mechanism that the Republicans use this time is in violation of the agreement that we made last July. We have an agreement. We have cut domestic discretionary spending enough. That was the agreement we made. And what they've done, they come back and whack it more, which I repeat is going back on our August agreement on how much we're spending on appropriations. Not only that, but the Republicans do what they've done time and time again. Mr. President, we all know that we would be better off if we didn't have as many regulations as we have, and that's why every president, including President Bush and, of course, President Clinton, have done the best they could to eliminate unnecessary regulations. President Obama is doing the same thing. So the Republicans come here and say, the way to create jobs is to get rid of regulations. And on this way of paying for this smoke and mirrors that they have, they want to block implementation of the health care reform, leading to higher costs and more uninsured Americans. They want to block Wall Street reforms, increasing the risk of future financial crisis and taxpayer bailouts. Can you imagine at this stage of the world, we want to increase the power of those on Wall Street? I don't think the American people care about that. They want to block anti-pollution protections, leading to dirty air and more premature deaths and illness. They want to weaken food safety protections and weaken worker safety protections. I, of course, will urge my entire caucus to vote against this because it is a typical approach that the Republicans have used, and it has not created a single job. A single job. There's commentary in today's newspapers about what the House has been doing. They haven't done anything to create a job. That extremely powerful Republican caucus they have, nothing to create jobs, nothing. Now, Mr. President, I'm glad that we have a motto that says, "In God we trust." Can you imagine yesterday they voted on that, whether we wanted that we wanted to underline and underscore "In God we trust"? They spent yesterday debating that issue in the House of Representatives. That didn't create a single job. There's not a single United States senator that does not trust in God that I know of. They're debating that while people like Arthur Ferrejo are desperate for work, been out of work all these years, not a single thing they do to create jobs. The legislation we'll vote on at 3 o'clock will produce hundreds of thousands of jobs now.
Mr. President.
Republican leader.
My good friend just made a great campaign speech, but the election is in November of next year. If we want to accomplish something, we have to do it together. And we've had a series of votes here over the last few weeks, clearly designed to fail. The proposal my good friend is talking about, in all likelihood, is going to have bipartisan opposition, not developed with Republican input, and not designed to get an outcome. The House of Representatives on 15 different occasions recently has passed bills with bipartisan support that we're not taking up. Now, one of them, the 3% withholding bill, enjoys the support of the President of the United States as well. And it's my hope that in the very near future we can figure a way to actually pass something together that would become law. I wish we could put off the election until next year, because these efforts to do these messaging amendments, as politically invigorating as it may be to the base of the Democratic Party, don't have anything to do with actually passing legislation that could have a positive impact. And so we will have the 2 votes today, but I would urge my good friend to join me in looking for things upon which there is enough bipartisan support to actually make a law, not just try to make a point. I'm sure that it is the case that most Americans support raising taxes on high-income individuals. My guess is they might have a different view if they knew that 4 out of 5 of those individuals were actually business owners. Nevertheless, it's time, it seems to me, for us to quit making the campaign speeches and remember the election is in November of 12, not this month of 11, and see if we can't work together to pass legislation that the President can sign that will help move the country in a different direction.
Majority Leader.
My friend, the Republican leader, comes before this body today and says we should do our campaign speeches next year, when the world knows that my friend has said his #1 priority in this Congress is to defeat President Obama. We have had here for the last 10 months a campaign speech every day directed by my friend through his Republican colleagues and his caucus, doing everything they can to make President Obama look bad, doing nothing that will help our economy. Their goal is to do everything they can to drag down this economy, to do anything they can to focus attention negatively on the President of the United States in hopes that he can get my job, perhaps, and that President Obama will be defeated. So let's not talk about campaign speeches here on the Senate floor. Let's talk about reality. I do not believe that we should be concerned about a piece of legislation that asks the richest of the rich to pay a few pennies of their vast fortunes to put people like my friend back to work. That's what this is all about. The American people agree with what we're doing. We're trying to have this government involved in things that create jobs, not slogans, not let's get rid of those regulations. Do we believe in God? You know, that kind of stuff. Mr. President, that has not created a single job. What we want to do is create jobs. And we also, Mr. President, don't want to go back on the agreement that we had, that we worked on for months, the deficit reduction plan, raising the debt ceiling, where we agreed on what our spending should be for this coming year. And we'll see how sincere that my Republican colleagues are. The CR expires now in 2 more weeks. CR is a continuing resolution. Let's see if they go back on their word in that regard, that they're going to again threaten shutting down the government if they don't get whatever slogan that looks good during any specific period of time. We have the FAA that is about to go out of business again because the Republicans are unwilling to pass a bill without some labor issue that has nothing to do with the bill that was passed, zero to do with it. Even Delta Airlines, who has been the focus of this, the person that runs that company wants the FAA bill done. They recognize that they've been hurt very, very badly by what the Republicans have done to focus attention on them, attention they don't want focused on them. So I would hope, Mr. President, that we can do things that are good for the country on a bipartisan basis. And I think creating jobs is one of the most important things we can do. And I would say to my friend, we can stay here all day. I will get the last word. So it's 10:20 now. If we want to extend to 11:20, I'm going to get the last word on our conversation here today.
Mr. President, it certainly is the case that the majority leader can always have the last word. But I would say with all due respect to my friend, he just made another campaign speech. I think what the American people would like to see us do is actually pass something together that will become law. Pass something together that will become law. That's how you get an accomplishment under the U.S. Constitution. That's how you send it to the President. And we know how to work together to make things happen. We've done that in the past. All I'm suggesting is the exercise we're going to have later today has nothing to do with making law and making a difference. It's about making a point. And we both know how to do that. We both know how to make points and make laws. What we're doing later today is not about making laws. Now, I'm told by staff that I need to move to proceed to S-1786.
The motion will be pending.
Mr. President, I would finally say...
The majority leader.
Oh, I'm sorry. I would finally say this. I hope that we will have a new dawn arising soon, where we will see my Republican friends break away from this lockstep they've been in. I can't imagine that they really believe they're doing the right thing by voting against asking the richest of the rich, 2/10 of the richest people in America, 2/10 the richest people in America, not contributing a small amount to creating jobs in America today. That's what this is all about. And I would hope someday we'll see a few Republicans break from the pack and vote to create jobs rather than try to defeat President Obama come next November.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, the Senate will resume consideration of the motion to proceed to S-1769, which the clerk will report.
Motion to proceed to the consideration of S-1769, a bill to put workers back on the job while rebuilding and modernizing America.
Under the previous order, the time until 3 p.m. will be equally divided and controlled between the two leaders or their designees. The motion to proceed to Senate 1786 is also the matter of the Senate.
Mr. President,
The senator from Utah is recognized.
Mr. President, while growth, I've been interested in the comments between the two leaders, and I have to agree with the Republican leader that this is an exercise in many ways in futility because the bill brought forth by the other side has very little chance of passing through both houses of Congress because it's a partisan bill. Now, let me just mention a few things here this morning. While growth remains sluggish in our economy, unemployment high, and job growth insufficient to drive unemployment lower, the number of pages in the Federal Register is at an all-time high. Pages devoted to final rules rose by 20% between 2009 and 2010, and proposed rules have also risen by close to 20% to 2,439 in 2010. Of the 4,257 regulatory actions already in the pipeline, 219 are considered economically significant, meaning they are estimated to impose the cost of $100 million or more on the economy. By comparison, that is 28 more than this time last year and 47% more than in 2009. In total, the Obama administration has imposed 75 new major regulations costing over $38 billion annually. We wonder why our country's in such trouble. The minutes of the late September meeting of the Federal Reserve Monetary Policy Making Committee revealed that in talking to businesses and market participants, many contacts have, quote, cited uncertainty about regulatory and tax policies as contributing to businesses' reluctance to spend, unquote. If businesses are not spending because of regulatory uncertainty, then their customers will see lack of demand for their products. The lack of demand explanation for economic sluggishness offered by the administration and its Keynesian advisors begs the question of why there is a lack of demand. While there are likely several reasons, the Fed clearly identifies one of them: uncertainty about regulatory policies. Indeed, uncertainty regarding future regulatory policies as a contributing factor for business reluctance to hire and invest has been cited in minutes of the past 3 policy-making meetings of the Fed's Monetary Policy-Making Committee. And those identifying that such uncertainty is impeding job creation are American businesses and not government bureaucrats insulated from the front lines of businesses and not their Keynesian advisors. They are the boots on the grounds in the American economy, the very people who create jobs, most of whom are small business people. The legislation that I am introducing, or I have introduced, seeks in part to ease the burden of federal regulations on businesses, including smaller and younger businesses whose vibrancy is critical for job creation, and to provide a rational regulatory decision-making process to provide greater certainty to businesses about the future regulatory environment. Provisions in this act represent ideas that have garnered bipartisan support. Indeed, many of the provisions follow directly from the President's own Jobs Council, the President's Council on Jobs and Competitiveness, which, according to the Council, quote, was created to provide nonpartisan advice, unquote. I'm talking about the bill that we have filed on this side. The Jobs Council presented recommendations to President Obama on October 11, 2011, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Those recommendations stem from the Council's interim report titled, quote, Taking Action, Building Confidence, 5 Common Sense Initiatives to Boost Jobs and Competitiveness, unquote. Many of the provisions in my act stem directly from recommendations in the Council's report and from the report's call for a more rational federal regulatory system. Mr. President, allow me to offer some quotes and comments related to the President's Jobs Council interim report recommendations in the context of this act. First, the President's Job Council says that, quote, the nation's complex federal, state, and local permitting system can lead to unnecessary delays. In fact, large Department of Transportation projects can spend years getting the required environmental impact statement process completed under the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, unquote. I agree. And this legislation My legislation promotes more efficient regulation to rein in some of the burdensome federal red tape that stymies transportation infrastructure projects and job creation. At the same time, it fully recognizes environmental and safety concerns surrounding those projects. Relative to those concerns, the President's Job Council remarks that, quote, what's gotten less attention, however, is the number of jobs at stake, unquote. Second, the President's Jobs Council says that, quote, current markets face significant uncertainty. Tax policy, pollution restrictions, and performance standards are all in the flux, unquote. Now, I agree. And this side's legislation serves to reduce some of that uncertainty and promote rational regulatory decision-making with congressional review of rules and regulations that are of major economic significance and required approval of the very rules that would impose major costs on the U.S. economy and job creators. Third, the President's Job Council states that, quote, there is broad consensus that a key step towards jump-starting economic growth would be removing regulatory barriers and simplifying overly complex government processes. Their inefficiencies cost businesses time and money, unquote. I agree. And this legislation seeks, through rational regulatory decision-making and reviews, to remove unnecessary and costly regulatory barriers and provide simpler, more rational government regulatory processes. Fourth, the President's Jobs Council says, now this is the President's Jobs Council, it says, referring to executive orders to review regulations that, quote, unfortunately, the executive orders mandating regulatory analysis and review did not apply to IRCs, that is, independent regulatory commissions, such as the Securities and Exchange Commission or the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, because the law won't allow it. While some IRCs employ economic analysis when crafting new regulations, many do not routinely do so. As an example, in 2010, IRCs issued 17 economically significant regulatory actions, 16 of which were promulgated by the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Reserve System. None underwent the comprehensive regulatory impact analysis or included the cost-benefit analysis that is expected from executive branch agencies. The Council, therefore, recommends that legislation be passed that requires IRC's that they conduct cost-benefit analysis for all economically significant regulatory actions that may have an annual impact on the economy of $100 million or more, as well as any significant guidance that meets the same threshold, unquote. Now, I agree that this legislation will provide, the one that we have found on this side, this legislation will provide congressional oversight on any such performed by IRCs like the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Federal Reserve, and the Commodities Futures Trading Commission and other federal regulators for economically significant actions. Fifth, the President's Job Council says of its recommendations for economically significant regulatory actions that, quote, these recommendations are not designed to weaken regulation or regulatory agencies, but rather to improve the rulemaking process and to create more effective and less burdensome regulations that will promote economic growth and job recovery, unquote. I agree. And the Republican legislation promotes a rational regulatory system with improved rulemaking oversight to create more effective and less burdensome regulations in order to help promote jobs growth. I agree also with the spirit of the Jobs Council remarks that efforts like this legislation, far from, quote, gutting, unquote, regulations and, quote, threatening safety, unquote, will promote economic efficiency and renewed job creation. The call for rational regulation and rulemaking is in no way a gutting of regulations or a sacrifice of public safety or of environmental quality efforts. We all know that rules and regulations are quite likely to continue to grow and evolve. This legislation seeks only to put rational decision-making into the foundation of our regulatory and rulemaking processes that are too often driven by special interests of largely unaccountable and fully unelected federal regulatory bureaucrats wishing to impose their preferences on America's job creators. Mr. President, proponents of the so-called infrastructure bank have actively cited in recent advocacy speeches findings from global competitiveness reports of the World Economic Forum. Well, if ratings from the World Economic Forum guide their views and guide them to advocate hundreds of billions of dollars of taxpayer resources for a risky new GSE that they call an infrastructure bank, let's look at what the Forum has to say regarding the United States. First, in their recent global competitiveness report, in what are called, quote, the most problematic factors for doing business, unquote, in America, the top 4 factors out of 15 are tax rates, number 1, inefficient government bureaucracy, number 2, access to financing, number 3, and tax regulations, number 4. Inadequate supply of infrastructure rates, number 10, right below policy instability and restrictive labor regulations. There you have it. The Global Competitiveness Report that the administration and my friends on the other side of the aisle used to advocate a risky new infrastructure bank places taxes and inefficient government bureaucracy as the top 2 leading problems in doing business in America. Those are the top 2 factors that are holding back job growth, and a brand new risky infrastructure bank bureaucracy funded by permanent higher taxes would only make those problems worse. By contrast, the legislation that I offer directly addresses inefficient government bureaucracy by acting to ease the inefficient regulatory burdens imposed on job creators by largely unaccountable and unelected federal bureaucracies throughout our massive regulatory agency maze and their special interests. And I might add, those regulatory agencies seem clearly not to have job creation and easing of the plight of America's 14 million unemployed workers as part of their main interests. Mr. President, the legislation that I am proposing also provides for a fully paid-for highway extension through 2013 that will give states and contractors the certainty they need to begin large projects and create jobs. It calls for elimination of dedicated funding for transportation enhancements and gives states the authority to decide whether to spend resources on bike paths or other such transportation add-ons. It informs the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, to eliminate inefficient bureaucratic environmental red tape to accelerate project delivery and contracting, just as called for by the President's own Jobs Council. It addresses the bureaucratic red tape associated with the NEPA that the President's own Jobs Council identifies, and it contains reforms that have received the support of the Department of Transportation. It includes a provision to stop Environmental Protection Agency rules that serve to dry up costs of concrete and steel, which are key ingredients in the road and construction projects. It includes provisions for waivers of inefficient environmental reviews, approvals, and licensing, and permitting requirements on road, highway, and bridge rebuilding efforts in emergency situations. It imposes a regulatory timeout on regulations to help stem the regulatory tsunami that is impeding job creation. Mr. President, we face a national jobs and unemployment emergency. It is truly a crisis. The Federal Reserve, the President's own Job Council, and job creators in Utah and across America have made clear that onerous regulations and regulatory uncertainty are acting to cast a wet blanket on job creation in America. And the 14 million unemployed Americans are painfully in need of jobs. I and my fellow Republicans are listening. The legislation that I propose goes straight to the matter in the interest of job creation now, not years from now, once some inefficient, new, politicized, unelected federal bureaucracy called an infrastructure bank is up and running to supply taxpayer funds to specially chosen and favored risky projects, something we've seen plenty of in this administration, and some administrations in the past as well. The legislation that I propose addresses the repeated calls from job creators who are stymied by inefficient, burdensome regulatory red tape derived from special interest federal bureaucracies rather than the interests of American workers. The legislation that I propose draws from bipartisan recommendations, including recommendations from the President's own Bipartisan Jobs Council. The legislation that I propose accommodates fully paid-for infrastructure projects to be undertaken to help build roads, bridges, and a host of other projects without imposing permanent, job-killing, higher taxes during a national unemployment emergency. Mr. President, I urge all of my colleagues in the Senate to support this legislation. This idea of an infrastructure bank is just, it appears to me to be just a future example of what Fannie and Freddie were all about. And I think we can do this without having an infrastructure bank. We can do it better. We can do it pushing a lot of the President's ideas forward, a lot of the World Economic Forum's ideas, and a lot of ideas that both sides of the aisle have to conclude are important for overcoming this regulatory mess that's making it almost impossible to create jobs and almost impossible to get legislation through this body. Mr. President, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
The senator from Utah is recognized.
I ask unanimous consent that all of the time be divided.
The Senate is currently in a quorum call.
Oh, I ask unanimous consent the quorum call be rescinded.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the time be divided equally and not charged to one side or the other.
Without objection.
And I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
the quorum call be lifted.
Without objection, so ordered.